You don't hear the rain at first. You feel it. A muted vibration through the armoured glass, a rhythm that finds your nerves before your mind does. It's past midnight, and the motorcade glides through the sleeping city like a secret itself, headlights cutting soft ribbons of light through the mist. The dome of the Capitol looms ahead, pale and watchful, and for a moment, you wonder how long you've been pretending not to feel the weight of its gaze. That's when your phone vibrates. One message, 5 words. They found the records. Call. You stare at the screen as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less lethal, but they don't. They sit there, white text on black, calm as a death notice, and you realise the night you've been dreading for 3 years has quietly arrived. You never meant to become the kind of politician who lies for a living. That's the thing you need to understand about yourself before the rest of this story makes any sense. You genuinely didn't intend it. Early in your career, the idealism was real, threadbare but alive, like a plant surviving on minimal light. You remembered the constituent meetings in underfunded community halls, the faces of working people who shook your hand and said, "We're counting on you." And you felt the weight of that trust as something sacred. You came from nothing remarkable. A public school teacher for a mother, thoughtful but exhausted. A father who held jobs in the way some men hold grudges, tightly and then suddenly not at all. You grew up learning that dignity was something you manufactured for yourself because no one handed it to you. Scholarships, then law school, then the right clerking position, then the right firm, then the right campaign manager who saw in you the rarest combination of authenticity and ambition. Someone the public would trust instinctively. Someone who photographed like sincerity itself. What drove you into politics wasn't greed. That distinction matters, even now. It was the fear of going back. Back to powerlessness. Back to irrelevance. Back to the world happening to you rather than through you. You believed, sincerely in the beginning, that power was a tool, and that a careful craftsman could build something worthwhile with it. But power has a way of becoming the point of itself, and somewhere between the first campaign and the 5th re-election, between the first compromise and the 100th, the tool began to use the craftsman. The scandal was not dramatic in its origins. That's the other thing you need to understand. It didn't arrive like a bolt of lightning or the offer of a briefcase. It crept in the way all serious rot does, slowly, dressed in reasonable clothing, each step logical given the step before it. It started with Harlan. Marcus Harlan had been a donor since your 2nd term, not top tier, but consistent, the kind of generous figure who expects access without naming it explicitly. A developer with interests in urban infrastructure contracts, he had the patient, well-fed confidence of a man who understood investment in the long-term sense. You liked him, honestly. He was smart, funny at dinner, and framed his interests in the language of civic good with such ease that it didn't always feel dishonest. The meeting that changed everything happened on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, unremarkable in weather, in nothing to suggest a turning point. You were in your regional office, not the grand Washington office, but the smaller constituency space that felt more like a law firm waiting room. Harlan came alone, which was unusual. No assistant, no folder of talking points. Just him, 2 coffees, and a tone you hadn't heard from him before. Careful, low, with an undercurrent of urgency he was working to suppress. He placed a single folder on the desk between you. Inside were documents, financial records, correspondence, and a report commissioned by a private intelligence firm. The report detailed, in clinical language, a set of transactions that connected your campaign fund to a shell company in Cyprus, which in turn was linked to a real estate conglomerate that had received preferential treatment in 3 municipal contracts during your first term as senator. The amounts were not enormous by the standards of modern political corruption, but the chain was clear, the documentation thorough, and if it reached the press, it would end everything you had built. You looked up at Harlan. He sipped his coffee quietly. "There are 2 copies," he said. "One is in a secure location. One is in front of you." You didn't ask the obvious question because you already knew the answer. He didn't want money. He wanted the infrastructure bill, specifically a rider amendment that would reclassify waterfront redevelopment zones and open them to private bidding. It would be worth hundreds of millions to the right developer, to Harlan specifically. You stared at the folder for what felt like a very long time. And then you said, "Give me a week." What you don't realize yet, what you can't see in that moment, is that a week is already too long. The door you were standing in front of had been closing slowly for years. By asking for a week, you stepped through it. Escalation. At first, you told yourself you were buying time to find another way out. You called your most trusted legal advisor, a woman named Priya, who had navigated campaign finance grey areas with you before, always with her eyes open. You didn't tell her everything, just enough, framed as a hypothetical, the kind of careful half-truth that lets you maintain the illusion of managing information rather than hiding it. Priya's assessment was swift and unhelpful. If those documents are genuine and reach a prosecutor, it depends entirely on the paper trail's interpretability. Plausible deniability is possible, but not guaranteed. And if someone already has them, that someone controls the timeline, not you. You already knew that. What you needed was a reason to believe there was another option, and she hadn't given you one. So you circled back to Harlan, because the alternative, full exposure, investigation, the dismantling of everything, felt genuinely unthinkable. Not just for your career, for the legislation you'd spent 4 years shepherding, for the people who trusted you. You told yourself, in the circular logic that only makes sense when you're already compromised, that protecting your position was also protecting the people who depended on you. That the greater good required a quiet, contained transgression. The Rider Amendment passed in committee 6 weeks later, buried in a 300-page infrastructure omnibus that nobody had the time or patience to read in full. 2 journalists wrote brief pieces about the waterfront reclassification, focusing on technical zoning language. No one connected it to Harlan. No one connected it to you. And just like that, you exhaled. Then slowly, over the following months, the weight you thought you'd set down revealed that it had only shifted. Harlan contacted you again, not with threats this time, but with the easy comfort of someone who now understood the shape of your limits. He wanted a meeting with the transport secretary. A minor thing, a 20-minute introduction. You arranged it, then a word in the right ear about a regulatory review timeline. Then a quiet suggestion to a committee chair about the priority of an unrelated municipal bond package. Each ask was smaller than the first. Each felt manageable. Each was another stone placed in a wall that was building itself around you, while you convinced yourself you were still standing in open air. Over time, what had been extortion became something more unsettling. It became routine. Harlan stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like a business partner, which is perhaps the most insidious evolution of all. You had brunch with him once and laughed genuinely at something he said, and only later, lying awake, did you feel the full horror of that laughter. Meanwhile, you were still doing real work. That's the part that is psychologically hardest to reconcile. You passed the Clean Infrastructure Act, a bill that genuinely improved air quality standards in a dozen cities. You funded 3 rural hospital expansions. You championed a housing voucher reform that wasn't politically glamorous but materially improved lives. You were, by any measurable standard of policy output, a good legislator, and you used that goodness the way a man uses a clean shirt, to cover what's beneath. Your team noticed shifts in you, though they named them differently. Your chief of staff, a relentlessly competent man named Owen, started saying you seemed more cautious in meetings, less willing to pick fights. He framed it as political maturity. Your press secretary noticed you'd stopped doing the unscripted Q&A sessions that had defined your early career, the raw, unrehearsed exchanges that voters loved. She assumed you were simply managing your public bandwidth. Only your wife, Elena, said something closer to true. One evening, after a campaign event, sitting in the car in the driveway because neither of you had moved to get out, she turned to you and said, "You don't seem like you're enjoying any of it anymore." Not angry, just quiet, observational, the way she had of seeing things sideways rather than head on. You told her it was the pressure. She nodded slowly and said, "I know." And you both went inside, and the conversation closed like a book neither of you wanted to finish. By the second year of what you privately thought of as the arrangement, you had developed a parallel life inside your own. There was the public self, measured, principled, competent, and the interior self, who catalogued every compromise with the grim precision of an accountant. You knew where everybody was buried, so to speak. Which meeting had been arranged for whom, which amendment had been written around whose interests, which phone call had been made to redirect which scrutiny. You also knew that your exposure wasn't limited to Harlan anymore. Small compromises attract other small compromises, the way damage in a structure attracts more damage, each weakness becoming a point of vulnerability for the next. A junior staffer named Kellerman had once made an offhand remark in a bar that suggested he knew more about the Cyprus transactions than anyone officially should. You'd quietly restructured his role to limit his access, then managed his departure from your office with a glowing reference and no explanation. A journalist named Sarah Voss at the Tribune had begun filing FOIA requests around your infrastructure committee work. Nothing focused enough yet to be alarming, but the pattern of her requests suggested she was drawing a map. Your communications director flagged her early, and you made sure to give her 2 exclusive interviews on unrelated topics. Accessible, charming, offering enough transparency in one area to suggest there was nothing being hidden in another. It worked for several months. At some point, you began to understand that you were no longer just protecting a secret. You were managing an ecosystem of concealment, one that required constant maintenance, whose edges kept expanding outward, whose internal logic demanded ever more elaborate justifications. Each containment effort was itself a new risk. Each person who knew anything was another variable. You slept lightly, ate less at dinner than you used to, and developed a habit of reading committee minutes late at night that Elena eventually stopped questioning. The thing about sustained deception, and this is something no one tells you, is that it doesn't primarily exhaust you through effort. It exhausts you through vigilance. The effort of maintaining version A while living version B while performing version C for the cameras. The constant calculation of what each person knows, what they might infer, what question they might ask next. You become a kind of human switching station, routing different signals to different destinations, and the traffic never stops. You began to envy, slightly and then enormously, people who didn't have to manage this. Ordinary people, staffers, citizens who lived singular lives in which what they said and what they meant were the same thing. It was Owen who brought you the first concrete warning that the ecosystem was starting to fail. He came into your office on a Tuesday morning, closed the door without being asked, and placed a printed email thread on your desk. He stood back with his arms folded, and his expression, careful, stripped of affect, told you he'd already decided how to feel about this, but was giving you the courtesy of reading first. The thread was from an anonymous account, addressed to a senior editor at a national outlet.
It claimed to have access to financial records linking your office to a pattern of regulatory favours benefiting a private development network. The language was specific enough to suggest genuine knowledge, not guesswork, not fabrication. Specific enough that your stomach dropped before you finished the second paragraph. How did we get this? You asked, keeping your voice level with the practiced ease of someone who'd been keeping their voice level for years. Our opposition research team monitors for anything that mentions your name in press inboxes when sources offer leads through indirect channels, Owen said carefully. This one went to 3 editors. We have it because one of them is friendly and tipped us. 3 editors.
That meant it had already moved beyond a single actor. Someone was actively distributing this, which meant they'd made a decision. Not to hold the threat over you, but to use it. That distinction was everything. Harlan held threats as currency. Whoever sent this email was spending it. You asked Owen if he thought it was Harlan. He paused, choosing his answer carefully. The timing doesn't fit his incentive structure. He's still mid-project on the waterfront development. He needs you functional. A pause. Which means it's someone else. Someone else. Those 2 words introduced a new dimension of dread. Because Harlan, you knew. Harlan had a face and a schedule and a legible set of motivations. Someone else was an open variable. Potentially anyone who had passed through the margins of the arrangement over the past 3 years. Anyone who'd seen a document or heard a conversation and kept quiet until now. You dismissed Owen, sat alone for a moment in the hum of the office, and for the first time, let yourself think the sentence you'd been successfully avoiding for years. This might not be containable. You didn't act on that thought immediately. Instead, you did what you always did. You managed. You called a crisis communications consultant through an intermediary, framing the hypothetical with enough distance to get useful guidance without exposing anything directly. You instructed your legal team to quietly audit every document that had ever touched the infrastructure committee work. You had a conversation with Harlan over lunch that was casual on the surface and surgical underneath, probing whether he'd changed his approach without accusing him of anything. Harlan, for his part, seemed genuinely unconcerned, either because he wasn't responsible for the email or because he was a better actor than you'd given him credit for. You left the lunch more uncertain than when you arrived, which was its own kind of answer. Then, Voss published her first real piece. It wasn't the full story. She didn't have enough for that yet, but it was pointed and clean. A 1,200-word analysis of the waterfront zoning amendment that traced the beneficiaries, noted the unusual speed of its committee passage, and asked, in the careful language of journalism, whether the public interest had been adequately weighted against private ones. Your name appeared 4 times, Harlan's twice. The Cyprus connection wasn't mentioned, but its shadow was present in the outline of every paragraph. The story ran on a Thursday. By Friday, it had been cited by 2 cable segments and a dozen political blogs. Your office issued a statement about the merits of the infrastructure bill and the transparent process of its passage. The statement was polished and completely hollow, and everyone who read it knew it. Elena read the piece at breakfast and said nothing. That silence was heavier than any question she could have asked. After Voss's piece, the pace of events shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way of films where everything accelerates into noise, but steadily, the way a tide changes. Each week brought something new. A second source apparently gave Voss additional information, because her follow-up questions to your press office became more specific, more anatomically precise. She knew about the committee timeline. She knew about the 3rd contractor who'd been displaced when Harlan's firm entered the bidding pool. She didn't yet know about Cyprus, but she was walking toward it. Your legal team's audit had turned up something you hadn't expected.
An email chain from 4 years ago that should have been deleted but had been archived under an administrative protocol change. The chain discussed the Cyprus structure in language that was euphemistic but interpretable. If Voss or a prosecutor ever reached it, the plausible deniability Priya had once dangled as a theoretical lifeline would evaporate. You instructed the relevant records to be moved, not destroyed, which would have been criminal, but reorganized in a way that made them harder to locate without knowing precisely what to look for. This was itself a decision that crossed a new threshold, and you made it at 11 p.m. sitting alone in your home office, speaking in a clipped voice on the phone to a man whose discretion you'd purchased over time through small favours and the shared language of mutual risk. When you hung up, you sat in the quiet and felt the specific chill of someone who has just made the next mistake. What you don't realise yet, or perhaps what you won't admit that you do realise, is that you've stopped trying to escape and started trying to survive. Those are different projects. Escape requires a destination. Survival is just momentum. And momentum without direction is simply falling. Your approval ratings remained strong, which was almost grotesque. The public saw what was in front of them. A legislator with a good record, a calm demeanour, a family that photographed well. The Voss pieces existed in the awareness of political insiders and engaged readers, but hadn't yet reached the broader emotional register of the public. You were still trusted. Your own party shielded you reflexively because they needed your seat more than they needed to examine your ledger. Your opposition attacked you on policy rather than scandal because they didn't yet have what they needed to make it personal. You gave a speech in your home district in the middle of all this, a town hall on healthcare access in a gymnasium with folding chairs and fluorescent lights. 40 minutes, no teleprompter, just you and a microphone, and people who needed things. An elderly man asked about prescription drug costs, his voice cracking slightly. A young woman wanted to know about mental health funding in schools. You answered them honestly. You cared as you answered, genuinely, not performatively. And that was perhaps the worst thing about the whole evening, because you walked out into the parking lot afterward and realised that the person in that gymnasium and the person managing document relocations at 11 p.m. were the same person, and that the distance between them was not as vast as you needed it to be. You sat in the car for a long time before your driver pulled out. The name came from your legal counsel 6 weeks after the second Voss piece, Kellerman. The staffer you'd quietly transitioned out of your office 2 years earlier had resurfaced, not publicly, but in the investigation. He'd been speaking with a federal attorney in a field office, initially about something unrelated, and during the conversation had apparently offered a fragment of information about your office's financial structure. Whether he'd intended it as a strategic move or an accidental disclosure wasn't clear. What was clear was that a federal attorney was now paying attention. This was different from Voss. This was different from Harlan. A journalist could be managed, delayed, countered with competing narratives. A donor could be contained through shared interest. But a federal investigation, once opened, had its own gravity. It pulled toward itself rather than being pulled. You called Priya immediately. This time you told her everything. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted 3 full seconds, which, in a conversation between two people who have practiced composure for decades, is an enormous amount of time. You understand what this means, she said finally. It wasn't a question. Tell me anyway. If they open a full investigation and get subpoena power, the documents you've been keeping out of view become visible. The archive reorganization becomes obstruction. The entire chain from the original amendment through every subsequent favour becomes prosecutable. She paused. And if they're already talking to Kellerman, they may have more than you think. You asked her what your options were. She gave you 2. You could get ahead of it, approach through intermediaries, begin a quiet cooperation, try to frame the narrative as self-disclosure rather than exposure. In exchange for cooperation and testimony, prosecutors sometimes structured outcomes that preserved personal freedom, if not career. Or you could fight, retain a full criminal defense team, prepare for a public battle, challenge every element of the investigation's basis, and hope the case had insufficient foundation to reach indictment. The third option, you said carefully, is that this resolves some other way. Another pause. I wouldn't build a strategy around a third option, she said. You thanked her and ended the call and remained in your chair for a very long time, watching the light change in the room as afternoon became evening. The choice arrived not as a single moment, but as a converging pressure from all directions simultaneously, the way structural failure in a building happens. Not one crack, but several cracks reaching toward each other until the material between them is simply gone. Voss reached out directly to your press office with a list of 15 questions. The questions were so specific, so anatomically precise about the Cyprus structure, the original amendment, and the subsequent favours, that they could only have come from someone with direct knowledge, either Kellerman or someone else who had been in rooms you thought were sealed. The questions included one that referenced a specific internal email that you were almost certain had been reorganised out of accessible reach. Almost certain. At the same time, a source inside the Federal Attorney's Office told your legal team that a grand jury had been convened. Not yet charged, just convened, which meant the machinery was turning.
And then Owen came to you, your chief of staff, your most loyal professional relationship, and placed a resignation letter on your desk. He didn't say much. He said he believed you were a good person, who had made choices that he couldn't be adjacent to anymore. He said it without anger, which made it worse. He shook your hand and walked out. You sat with the resignation letter in front of you and understood, fully and without the cushion of rationalization, that you had reached the moment you'd been constructing for 3 years without meaning to. The moment where every path forward had a cost, and the only question was which cost you could live with. There were 3 real options, and you thought them through clearly, perhaps for the first time, perhaps because clarity arrives only when there's nothing left to obscure. You could fight, retain the defense team, challenge the investigation, go public with a narrative that framed the whole thing as political persecution. Your party had people who would rally around that frame. A segment of your base would believe it, loudly and loyally. The legal battle would take years, and the outcome was uncertain. You might survive it, not intact, but functional. But the fight would require you to be fully, publicly dishonest in a way that dwarfed everything that had come before. It would require attacking Voss, discrediting Kellerman, and turning your own constituents' credulity against them. You would have to look directly into the camera and lie in a way that left no deniable distance. You could run, not literally, but politically, quietly, announce you would not seek re-election, let the investigation run its course without your public office as the central target, and hope that reduced political visibility reduced prosecutorial ambition. Some people navigated careers through exactly this kind of managed retreat. The problem was that the investigation was already open. Stepping back from office didn't close it. Or you could cooperate. Tell the truth, fully and without strategic omission, beginning with Priya and then moving to wherever she directed. Accept that your career was finished, that there would be legal consequences that might include criminal exposure, that the public story would be the one you'd spent years dreading, and then live, diminished, judged, honest, in whatever remained. You sat with those options in the silence of your office, alone now in a way you'd been building toward for years. And you thought about the man in the gymnasium with the folding chairs, about the elderly man asking about prescription costs, about Elena saying, "You don't seem like you're enjoying any of it anymore."
you thought about your father, who drank away his best years making small, bad choices that compounded into something he couldn't escape, and who spent the last decade of his life in a contraction of shame and avoidance that looked like nothing so much as the life you had been quietly building for yourself. You picked up the phone. You called Priya. You said, "I want to cooperate. Full disclosure. Tell me what to do next." Your voice, when you said it, was steadier than you expected. There was something in making the worst decision, the most costly, most humbling, most irreversible one, that carried its own strange weight. Not lightness exactly, but solidity. The feeling of a person who has finally stopped moving in a direction and planted their feet. The investigation took 14 months from the point of your cooperation to its legal resolution. Nothing about it was clean, or quick, or redemptive in the way films tend to compress it. There was a plea agreement, structured around your cooperation and testimony against several third parties, including a network that connected to Harlan's operations far more extensively than you had understood when you were embedded in it. Your testimony contributed to 3 additional indictments.
You resigned from office on a Tuesday morning in autumn, releasing a statement that you had written yourself without a communications director. It was 23 sentences long, acknowledged wrongdoing without minimising it, and used no passive voice. You didn't say mistakes were made. You said, "I made choices that betrayed the people who trusted me, and I am prepared to accept the consequences of those choices." Political commentators noted that it was, by the standards of such statements, unusually direct. Some treated that as suspicious. Others didn't. The legal outcome was a suspended sentence with significant financial penalties, formal community service obligations, and a permanent prohibition from holding federal office. You would not go to prison, which your legal team considered a favourable result given the full scope of the case, and which you were privately unable to regard as either victory or injustice, only consequence. Voss published her full investigative piece the day after your resignation. It was thorough, restrained, and devastating in the way only careful journalism can be. More damaging than any angry editorial, because it simply told the story in sequence, action by action, decision by decision, without editorialising about your character. The decisions editorialise themselves. Elena stayed. That surprised you, and you told her so. And she said, "I'm not staying because this is okay. I'm staying because I know the person you actually are, and I want to find out if he's still in there." You didn't have an answer for that, which she seemed to understand. You moved back to your home district, to a much smaller house in the neighbourhood where you grew up. The adjustment was not graceful. There were weeks of profound disorientation. The absence of the machinery, the staff, the schedule, the daily confirmation of significance. You felt, for months, genuinely invisible, and understood for the first time how much of what you had called purpose had actually been identity maintenance. Slowly, over the following year, something shifted. You took a position with a non-profit legal aid organisation, doing unglamorous work, housing cases, benefits appeals, the repetitive bureaucratic labour of helping people navigate systems that weren't designed with them in mind. It paid a fraction of what you'd earned. Nobody photographed you doing it. You found, carefully and without certainty, that you could still be of use, that the skills you'd built, strategic thinking, institutional knowledge, the patience to read a complex case and find the pressure points, had value outside the structure you'd corrupted them in. You found, slowly, that work could feel clean again. Not unburdened by the past, but clean in the sense of aligned, the sense of a thing that is what it appears to be. You spoke at a civic ethics seminar 18 months after your resignation, reluctantly at the organiser's persistent invitation because you thought your credibility was somewhere near the floor.
You talked for 40 minutes to an audience of political science students about the specific mechanics of how compromise compounds, about how rationalization works, about the moment you decided to cooperate and why. You did not make yourself a redemption story. You said plainly that there was no version of the story in which what you did was acceptable, and that the work afterward, whatever good it contained, was not a counterbalance, but simply the next chapter in a life that had to continue being lived. Afterward, a student came up and asked what the hardest moment had been. Not the legal proceedings, not the resignation, not the public story, but the single hardest moment. You thought about it honestly, which you'd learned to do. Owen's resignation letter, you said, because he didn't come in angry, he came in quietly.
And he shook my hand. And that was when I understood how completely I'd become someone else. The student nodded and walked away, and you stood there in the corridor for a moment, thinking about the gymnasium with the folding chairs, and the elderly man, and the fluorescent lights, and whether any of it had been real. You decided that it had been, that the good and the corrupt had existed simultaneously, fed by the same person, drawing from the same source, that this didn't neutralize either of them, but complicated both, and that living with that complexity, not resolving it into a clean narrative, not writing yourself as villain or victim, but simply holding it, clearly, without flinching, was perhaps the only form of honesty still available to you. You walked out into the afternoon. Nobody recognized you, and you felt, for the first time in many years, like exactly the size of person you actually were. The story of a scandal is rarely about the scandal itself. It's about the architecture of small choices that made it possible. Most people who end up in the position you were in didn't arrive there in a single leap. They arrived there one step at a time, each step defensible given the last, each act of concealment building on the previous one, the whole structure growing taller and more elaborate until the person living inside it can barely remember what the ground floor looked like. What's worth carrying from this story is not the warning about corruption in the abstract, it's the more specific warning about the moment when survival and escape diverge, when you stop trying to find a way out and start trying to manage the walls closing in. That's the moment when the real cost begins to accumulate. The most honest thing you can say, looking back, is that cooperation, the act of telling the truth fully at enormous personal cost, was the only decision in years that felt like a decision at all. Everything before it had been reaction. That choice, and only that choice, was yours. If this story reached you in some way, if the characters' rationalizations felt recognizable, if the slow drift felt true, that recognition is worth something. Most of us won't face a federal investigation, but the architecture of justification, the logic of the next small step, the weight of maintaining a version of yourself that diverges from reality, those are not exclusive to politics. The question worth sitting with is a simple one. At what point in the story would you have chosen differently?